Okay, so in the next few lectures, I want to talk about the freedom of the will. And I want to do this for a few reasons. One, I think this is a very interesting topic in and of itself. Two, I think it'll get us into some interesting issues about the nature of time. Um, so talk about freedom of the will for a bit, then we'll get into issues on the nature of time, then we'll kind of circle back around to freedom of the will after that. But to start with, I just want to say a little bit about why this issue is important and what it even really is. Always important, I find, in teaching to explain this, okay, why should I care question, right? So to see why it's important, I think we need to think about some common assumptions about responsibility. When are people responsible for their actions? And what do I mean by responsibility? Well, when does it make sense to praise or blame someone for what they do? In some cases we might go beyond praise or blame. We might reward or even punish people. But when does it make sense to even go with the smaller thing of praising or blaming somebody? Let's consider some cases. Before we get to general rules, I think it'll help to talk about some concrete cases. So let me just start with a few cases from class. And I'll just give you two that are really just sort of contrasting in my reaction. So I had a student years ago, one of my better students just fall asleep in class. Like I'll look over, this student is asleep. I don't say anything about it to them. It's kind of a little hurtful, right? This is maybe my best student in this class, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, if the best student is asleep, I'm really messing it up today, right? Later, this student told me that they had narcolepsy and that their drugs, they were getting them adjusted, and I'm like, okay, I don't blame this person at all for falling asleep in my class. If you guys don't know, narcolepsy is a disease. You just kind of randomly fall asleep and you can't help it, right? I don't blame them one bit. This is not, something I should blame someone for, right? Why is that? Well, you don't choose to have narcolepsy. You don't choose to have this disease. And if you have this disease, you don't really choose when and where you fall asleep, right? So there's nothing this student could have done otherwise. I feel bad for them because they're embarrassed. I don't certainly blame them at all, right? Contrast this with, I have this student a couple of years ago, and one of the rules I have in class is just don't text on your phone, right? It just really, really annoys me, right? Obviously you're not paying attention if you're on your cell phone. And, when I do have in-person classes, part of the grading is attendance and participation. Why should I give you points for attendance and participation if you are glued to your cell phone texting and are here in body but not in mind at all, right? They wouldn't pay you at work for showing up and completely zoning out. In the same way, I'm not going to give you a good participation grade for showing up, completely zoning out, and disrupting the rest of my class because you're like, I don't know, sitting there texting, right? So this student will not stop it, right? And I finally, talk to him, like, please don't do this. It's disruptive. It's in the syllabus. You agreed not to do this when you took the class. I make you guys sign off on the syllabus policy. It's right there in bold. Please do not text. He keeps doing it. And I finally just tell him in class, I'm like, look, if you keep doing that, I'm going to mark you absent every day you sit there and text. You might as well stay home if you do that. Well, he gets really whiny and he says, well, that's just an unreasonable policy. I just can't help, people my generation, I just can't help texting, right? And that's nonsense, right? Or at least I think it is, right? You can help texting. You make a choice to pull your phone out of your pocket and sit there and text, right? Not like this guy even had a good reason, right? I will make exceptions if people have children in daycare or they're taking care of a parent or something and they urgently need to get a text. This dude wasn't that, right? I blame him. I hold him responsible. I have no problem marking him absent every single day he sits there and texts because, unlike the student who has narcolepsy, I think he can help it, right? Student with narcolepsy can't choose whether or not they go to sleep in class. I think this dude can very well help pulling out his phone and texting. Student with narcolepsy can't choose to do otherwise. Mr. Texting Dude, he can, right? Sorry, it's just still annoyed by that. I can't help doing this. I'm like, dude, if you literally cannot help it, we have bigger problems, right? Right, and you can think of other things. What do we blame people for? What do we excuse or say is not their fault, right? I think praise is pretty similar, but blame is maybe more obvious, right? Let's say someone agrees to help you move and they don't show up and you call them to find out, well, why aren't you here? And they're like, oh my goodness, my car was stolen, right? I literally cannot come there because my car was stolen. Suppose you call them. I actually knew a guy who did this to another friend of ours. I think this is kind of a mark of a low character. He agreed to help my friend move. I agreed to help my friend move. We call, lo and behold, this guy. Bill will not pick up. He doesn't show up. And after the fact, he's like, I stayed up too late the night before. I just, I couldn't do it. Look, he could choose to do otherwise, right? You can't choose whether or not some random person steals your car. If you agree to help somebody do something early the next day, you can't avoid staying up the night before, right? I mean, knowing this guy, I'm going to guess he decided, guy was moving on a Saturday. I'm going to guess this guy decided, oh, it's Friday. I'm going to do something fun. My bet is he was also a little hungover Saturday morning, right? But if you agree to do something to help somebody, you can hold off drinking for that one Friday night, get up early on the Saturday and help them, right? Unless you're an addict, and this guy wasn't. He was just unreliable, right? Can't help, can't choose, can't do otherwise as far as your car is stolen. You can hold off drinking a lot a night before you're supposed to help somebody move, right? And this extends to even bigger things, right? You guys can probably think of examples too, like where we would blame somebody and where we wouldn't. Seems to be if the person could do otherwise, we will blame them, right? Or we feel like we can blame them if they do something wrong. If they can't, then we don't. So the idea is, if someone cannot avoid doing something, we don't hold them responsible. If someone has a condition that makes them just fall asleep, you don't hold them responsible for falling asleep in class, even if it might be disruptive to class and mildly embarrassing as a teacher to have someone in the front row sleeping, right? You do hold them responsible for sitting there glued to their phone right up in front of their face in the front row because they can help that, right? Fill in your own examples, right? They are everywhere. And, this goes in with bigger things, right? In criminal law, if someone is insane so that they can't help acting like they do, we don't punish them. If you literally cannot resist a compulsion, that is a reason not to hold you responsible for a crime. more science fiction examples, brainwashing or mind control. There's some argument about whether brainwashing is real. There definitely do seem to be cases of so-called Stockholm syndrome, where people come to sympathize with their kidnapper that look a lot like what we might call brainwashing, right? Mind control science fiction, but, if someone could literally put a wire, a little control device in your brain to make you do what they said, we wouldn't hold you responsible for doing that, right? So, whether or not you can do otherwise, as Nagel says in his article, he uses a really trivial example of getting dessert. This seems to hold for little stuff like dessert, bigger stuff like helping someone move or, not disrupting your philosophy class, and even bigger stuff like actual crimes, right? If you cannot do otherwise, you are not responsible. To be responsible either in the sense that you merit praise or blame, reward or punishment, it seems that you have to be able to act otherwise, to do something different than you in fact did. Okay, so determinism and libertarianism, and I should say libertarianism about the will. There are, libertarianism is one of those terms that might mean different things. There's political libertarianism, which has some connections to libertarianism about the will, but they're not sort of neatly tied together. You can be a libertarian about the will and not be a political libertarian. I'll lay my cards on the table and tell you guys, I am a libertarian about free will. I'm not a political libertarian. At least won't go as far as a lot of these guys do. Right? But so determinism and libertarianism, by which I mean libertarianism about the will here, are in a sense opposed positions. Libertarianism says that no one ever has free will. So no one is ever responsible for their actions. The determinist would say, when you get down to it, there's no difference between the guy who texts in class and the person who has narcolepsy. They might look different, but he's no more free not to pull his phone out and text than the person is free to choose not to have narcolepsy and not to fall asleep. So if the determinist is right, my student, even though I don't think he thought in these terms, he would be right to say, I literally can't help it. There's nothing, I can't act otherwise, right? Determinism is a very revisionary position, by which I mean that if determinism is right, we are going to have to rethink and revise a lot of our beliefs about responsibility. In fact, we're going to have to pretty much throw the whole idea of responsibility out the window. We're going to have to do away with a lot of the distinctions we draw about different kinds of behavior. I'll say more about this in a minute. Libertarianism about the will is maybe the more common sense position. The position that a normal person probably believes before he or she takes a philosophy class. And libertarianism about the will says this: normal adult humans in normal circumstances have free will. We are usually responsible for our actions. Look, the libertarian will say there are exceptions, right? If someone really is insane and suffers a compulsion, they might not have free will. If someone suffers from certain diseases, they might not have free will about certain things, right? But normally or there might be cases where people are compelled to do stuff or whatever. There are cases where normal adults might not have free will, but the normal case is adults do have free will. They can choose what they do. Children, who knows, there may be a borderline case, but normal adults in normal circumstances have free will. And the libertarian would say precisely the cases where we think we might not hold someone responsible are the cases where we think people don't have free will. So I say libertarianism and determinism are opposed, or I think I might have said opposed in one sense, or apparently opposed, because they do agree on one thing. They agree on this condition: for anyone to be responsible for an action, it must have been possible for that person to do otherwise. The action must be under that person's control. If you cannot do otherwise, you are not responsible for the action. So, basic determinist position. For anyone to be responsible for an action, it must have been possible for that person to do otherwise. Premise 2. It is never possible for any person to act otherwise than he or she did. Conclusion: so no one is ever responsible for any action. The basic libertarian position. For anyone to be responsible for an action, it must have been possible for that person to do otherwise. In normal circumstances, normal adult human beings can act otherwise than they did. The guy can choose not to grab the dessert in the cafeteria line. Texting Jimmy can choose not to pull. His name wasn't James, right? I'm not giving this guy's name away. I'm just derisively calling him Texting Jimmy, right? But anyway, Texting Jimmy can choose not to pull his phone out, right? So on and so forth. If I don't grade your papers for 3 weeks, I'm to blame because I could choose to actually grade your papers in a timely fashion, right? In normal circumstances, normal adult humans can choose to act otherwise than they did. I blame him because if I'm a libertarian, I think he can put his phone away and should. So in normal circumstances, normal adult human beings are responsible for their actions. Now, I think that the determinist here has an argument. I'm not quite sure I would say the libertarian has an argument for that we do have free will, sketching the position. I think there might be a little bit more that needs to go in to show that we do have free will. These debates get really involved, so I'm not going to go into it. It gets really confusing, but just these are the basic sketches of the positions. So, the key disagreement between libertarians and determinists comes down to whether or not we have an ability to do otherwise. Premise 2. Determinists say we never have this ability. Libertarians say we usually have it in normal circumstances. On the one hand, never to usually, right? So, and I think the libertarians and the determinists are on solid ground in both assuming premise 1, right? This condition for anyone to be responsible, they must have been able to do otherwise. This thought, the ability to do otherwise, is key to responsibility, plays a huge role in our practices and culture. Think of this, right? if you have a documented learning disability, we as a society think, and we as a college have a policy, that the professor has to make certain accommodations, right? And part of that is, well, it might be harder for you to learn certain material, but that is no fault of your own, right? You can succeed if you're allowed some allowances, and you should be allowed those allowances because whatever disability you have is no fault of your own. Same with other disabilities, right? We as a society should put in ramps so that people in wheelchairs can get into buildings, can do the jobs that other people do because, and we should make these allowances because it's not their responsibility that they have this condition, right? Contrast that with somebody who wanted allowances in a class and said, well, yeah, see, the thing is, I'm just really lazy. Right? Someone has dyslexia, we would think definitely you should give him allowances in this class. To not do so would be indecent. You would be a horrible person. You would get into trouble with the school, and rightly so. On the other hand, if you laughed in the face of the guy who said, you need to give me allowances in this class because, see, I'm really lazy, I think most of us would say you should laugh in his face, right? He can help being lazy, or so we think. Once you've gotten the habit of being lazy, it might not be just as easy as switching, flipping a switch, I'm not going to be lazy anymore. But we would think this is his fault because even if it is a habit that's hard to break, he has gotten into the habit of being lazy, and he should try to get out of that habit, right? The same goes for, a lot of other stuff. If your employer needs to make allowances because you use a wheelchair, we would say, the Americans with Disabilities Act would say, okay, the employer in a lot of circumstances has to do that. Reasonable allowances, contrast that with, well, I like to stay up really late. I don't like to get in bed before 2, so I know you want me to come in at 7, but y'all need to just push the workday back to 10, 11, right? Again, if you've gotten the habit of going to bed late, it might be hard to break, but you can change that. That is in your control. We're not going to allow somebody to start the workday at 11 just because he likes to stay up late, right? This even comes into political debates, right? Liberals and conservatives both reach for these reasons. Conservatives will say, well, look, isn't it wrong to take money from the rich if the rich have worked really hard for it? Liberals will say, well, a lot of rich people don't work really hard for it. Do you really deserve it if you just inherit it from Uncle whoever? They'll also say, well, a lot of poor people are poor through no fault of their own. It's just bad luck. Liberals and conservatives both will seem to assume, ability to do otherwise, what people have chosen to do makes a big difference. If nothing you've done makes you rich, it's different than you have chosen to do something. If it's no fault or nothing you've done that makes you poor, that's different from, well, I have a friend from college who does not like to work at all. He's poor. He earns about $15,000 a year. He also works about 10 hours a week, right? He has chosen somebody who's poor through bad luck has not. So these assumptions seem pretty fundamental to a lot of our reactions and a lot of our practices, even our laws and policies, right? If determinism is true, we are going to have to rethink all that. You know, maybe, if determinism is true, it doesn't seem like I can just laugh off the guy who says, well, I'm really lazy, right? A lot of other stuff would have to change, especially criminal punishment. We would have to fundamentally rethink. A lot of our political debates about desert, what people have chosen, what's luck, wouldn't even make sense anymore. Libertarianism about the will is, in a sense, a more conservative position. And by this, I don't necessarily mean politically conservative. A lot of people on the left are libertarians about the will, the same a lot of people on the right are libertarians about the will. What I mean is we would not have to rethink and revise our fundamental practices, laws, assumptions to the same degree with libertarianism. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see why that matters. Now, but before looking at whether determinism is true and looking at the arguments for determinism, I want to briefly look at a position that says this whole debate between libertarians and determinists is wrong. Compatibilism denies premise 1. For anyone to be responsible for an action, it must be possible for that person to do otherwise. Compatibilism will say that is not true. Compatibilism says ability to do otherwise is not key to responsibility. The compatibilists agree with the determinists. No one ever has an ability to do otherwise, but they reject this idea that that's necessary for responsibility. So on the other point, they'll agree with the libertarian. People are sometimes responsible for what they do, usually responsible. So differs from both libertarianism and determinism in that it rejects this premise that they agree on. And in its, different line of thinking, but in its conclusion agrees with libertarianism, even though it thinks about things completely differently. So, before we get more deeply into determinism, I do want to say a little bit about compatibilism in the next lecture, just kind of an aside. I have some problems with compatibilism, but I just at least want to explain why I'm not taking this possibility as seriously as the other two.